First of all, thank you everybody for joining in person, which is a really cool experience. For those of you at home as well, thanks for joining in. Good news is about everybody joining remotely is they don't have to deal with the sauna that we're in right now. The AC broke. Somebody needs to understand BACnet protocol and get the back up and running. But otherwise, we're good. So today I want to talk a little bit about some information on industrial control systems, specifically about taking and copying and pasting IT security into ICS and why that will fail. But of course, at the end of the conference, and as we go through today's presentation, is 5 top things to make you successful at critical infrastructure defense. So let's get through these slides. If my clicker was to work, that would be pretty epic. So a little bit of information on myself. Again, Dean Parsons, a certified SANS instructor for both courses ICS 515 and 418, and the co-author for 418 as well. I have 20 years experience in the field, started out with a green lightsaber on the IT side, and for the last 10 years of my career, been really focusing on the ICS side. So now I carry a red lightsaber. With that, though, I've used my knowledge and expertise in critical infrastructure to hire folks and teams to do analysis and assessments in critical infrastructure across the energy sector for transmission, distribution, and generation, but also in oil and gas facilities and marine terminals and so on and so forth. So as we go through, we're going to jump into the topics for today with this short session. We'll talk a little bit about some of the high impact, low frequency events, which I would argue are becoming more frequent. We'll talk about the differences between IT security and ICS security as well. We're going to give you a recipe for the workforce. We know there's a shortage, so this recipe is hopefully going to gravitate you towards selecting individuals you can retain and train for ICS specific security as we move through. Beyond that, anybody in the room who has technical knowledge about ICS, we're going to give you a model for practical defense. And for those of you in the room and online who are management level, who have the responsibility for ICS security at a management level, you'll leave here with 5 things you should be aware of if you're not aware of already. So we're going to jump right in. Anything we talk about in this section is applicable, of course, to all of the critical infrastructure sectors that you see here. Having said that, I'm not going to waste too much time saying that we have seen threats to ICS specifically. We've seen things like ransomware hitting the ICS environment, which are more opportunistic, but we've also seen, of course, targeted attacks at critical infrastructure. So we have been reading threat intelligence lately. You're aware of something called pipe dream, which is not a piece of malware that can cause disruption in critical infrastructure. It is a framework that is much more scalable than Crash Override that took down a power grid in 2016. It's more scalable than Traces that took down an oil and gas facility in 2017. So the things we're dealing with today are high impact, low frequency events, which means we're really looking at events that usually don't happen or they haven't happened yet. But when they do happen, then there are catastrophic failures. So these are things like that can potentially damage critical infrastructure, physically damage them, which we've seen in the past as well. And now these frameworks have some of these capabilities to make these things a scalable realization for critical infrastructure in many sectors in the ICS. Also, high impact, low frequency events, of course, as we're seeing, they're becoming more and more frequent. So the things that we've seen in the past are available now for adversaries to learn from, and we do see with Pipeline possibly some elements that have been repurposed from previous types of malwares in some cases. So the adversary is definitely becoming more skilled, and we're all aware what that means as well. Moving on, just looking at the last number of years, all of the high impact, low frequency events we've seen can be summarized in either a stage 1 attack on critical infrastructure or a stage 2 attack. So I want to draw your attention to the top right of the slide, which is stage 2. Here is where we see the most recent event and framework, which is called Pipeline. Up in the top right there, also Traces, the Ukraine attacks in 2015 and 2016, and so on and so forth. These events and now can be targeted, repurposed, and repackaged possibly to other sectors outside of the electric facility, for example, and also other types of sectors in critical infrastructure. What this means is we have to do more work in this space, but the good news is, not to worry, ICS Defense is doable, and I will show you that ICS Defense and critical infrastructure security, I would suggest and argue, is actually easier to do than in IT. So as we pivot through using threat intelligence specifically for critical infrastructure, wherever that may be coming from free sources or paid for services. We do see using threat intelligence a common attack path into critical infrastructure of all sectors. So we usually see something like an IT attack first. ICS attacks commonly come through the IT environment first. Whether it was a phishing campaign, et cetera, the adversary lands and wants to land in IT first. From there, they use to try to pivot through the IT environment into the ICS using multiple different vectors. I want to make very clear here, the attacks we are seeing in critical infrastructure are attacks that do not just contain malware. As we go through, we're going to see more and more of what's called living off the land. That means we're abusing the system and using the features available in the system itself natively against the system. So again, living off the land by using parts of the engineering system against itself, using it with just malicious intent or purpose. Beyond that, of course, we're seeing a pivot, if you will, a digital pivot or pathway through IT into the control system environment through various types of trusted assets. One of those assets that are commonly abused is called a data historian, which has information about your critical infrastructure, how it's operating, how effective it's operating, and so on and so forth. Beyond that, of course, the attacks that we have seen are, again, living off the land more and more, harder to detect, but possible to detect if we're looking at the network information on the control system. So these attacks are abusing the industrial control protocols, as it were. And the question is, how do we detect malicious activity or intent by the abuse of legitimate protocols and systems in the control system environment? We're reminded here, everything we just talked about came from ICS threat intelligence specifically. So leveraging at least freely and widely available threat intelligence for ICS will only make you better at defense. So the differences between IT security and ICS security, there are common differences here. And I love the fact that people from IT come into the ICS or recently assigned in responsibility for the ICS want to bring in the tools and processes and the techniques and technology from IT that we know have worked for decades in IT, which is awesome. So I love meeting people from IT who have that passion now assigned to protect critical infrastructure. But there are some nuances we should be aware of to make sure we're successful at this. So traditionally, IT has always been focused on data at rest, data in transit. Again, focusing on this, doing it very well for years. Whereas industrial control systems or OT environments are really focused on managing, monitoring, controlling real-time systems for physical input values and controlling physical output changes in the real world. Now, if you're thinking that OT security is a number of Windows boxes, you're partially right, because there's probably 10 or 20% of the control system that may make up traditional operating systems. I'd argue that 70 or 80% of those systems are then engineering devices not running common operating systems. So there's a nuanced discussion that we can have here. So specifically, the conversation comes up here, well, what about convergence? There, I said it, I didn't say the S word, Stuxnet, but I will talk about the C word, convergence, just for a moment. So the conversation of convergence comes up whereby, hey, what about convergence from technology? Well, we've actually converged in control systems 20 years ago, which means we've used and have been using and continue to use off-the-shelf traditional operating systems for control systems and for engineering applications. The conversation now is not, did we converge technology? Because we've done it a couple decades ago. The conversation now is focusing on the convergence of resources, the convergence of teams, the convergence of skill sets. So the question then is, if we converge these skill sets, can we converge an OT, IT, SOC to manage them all, one SOC to rule them all? And the thing is, we can. We talked earlier about IT being probably the first type of attack or vector to be attacked. So having a converged SOC makes sense to get an entire attack chain from IT into the ICS. So ICS can understand that the adversary is coming before they get into the control system. So a converged SOC makes sense, but anybody in a converged SOC must, in my opinion, should have engineering knowledge, a prioritization on safety to make sure when they triage something, they understand it's from an ICS perspective. If we take a look now at a control system at a very high level, this image really represents something called a Purdue model, but essentially we see traditional operating systems used at the top of this model. And this is not uncommon. If we were to walk into a critical infrastructure environment today, we all went down the street to the power plant, for example, and looked at the control center, we would walk in and see operators, engineers, using a Windows machine. That's fine and that's great and that's going to continue and we're embracing that and that's great. However, everything that Windows environment likely controls is an engineering asset, and that in Windows environment should, in my opinion, be treated as an OT device. So we have traditional operating systems, we have traditional protocols that you would normally see on some Windows environments or Linux environments. Below that, now we're getting into more engineering systems. Below this, in the yellow area, we have ICS and OT specific protocols you would not normally ever see on an IT environment. We also see embedded operating systems, industrial protocols, specific controls built for ICS environments, even proprietary protocols, safety, where safety is number one, and of course, additional information specific to engineering assets. But I will say that in a control system, I would wager it is all OT or ICS. So patching is a great thing to do. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm saying in the OT environment, yes, patch when it makes sense, patch when there's a risk and a vulnerability that has been analyzed to have impact in the control system. We don't normally see patching in OT as often as IT, and IT has that down pat for many, many years. Well-oiled machine for patching, which is great. But there's a different risk surface, a different mission, and a different impact in the OT environment. So patching a human-machine interface, for example, may or may not be your priority, because if I am an adversary and I get to the human-machine interface that controls the engineering process, I can manipulate that process without running malware, without doing anything malicious to the system, okay? So patching is great and all well and good. Patching in OT does not make sense in the same cycle as in IT. So all of this, I would wager, is an OT environment with different impacts, mission, and risk surfaces. Just a little bit on information that we've seen commonly targeted in the control system environment. We're going to see things like a human-machine interface, a safety instrumented system. We're going to see a data historian. We're going to see things like project files that run the ladder logic, if you will, or code on a plant floor. The little gray boxes run this project file code. And this is also targeted. Very few of these devices you see on screen is a traditional operating system, which means security here, monitoring here, skill sets to understand attacks towards these critical infrastructure devices and engineering systems requires a different approach. But again, worry not, we have the idea and an approach to this. If we take some of these assets we see in electric facilities, for example, not only are we going past the traditional operating systems, which we must secure as well, like we've done in the past in IT, we also have to consider additional devices. Some of those in the electric sector could be digital protection relays, for example, that we have highly connected over IP. Even in wind turbine, for example, we see the nacelles or the controllers at the top of a wind turbine to generate electricity. Controllers are in there as well, possibly some windows, but we do have controllers in there that we must consider. Now, if you're thinking now, what controls do we put in place? That's coming up in a few moments. In addition, some of those other types of assets we've seen exist in marine terminals, for example, in oil and gas, and so on and so forth. And the same can be said for things like oil and gas facilities, for storage plants as well, and so on and so forth. So again, the idea here is to understand there's multiple types of different assets, and there's a different way to secure them, which we'll get to in a second. So if we were to summarize the difference between IT and ICS security specifically, I would summarize them in these specific categories. Skill sets. Absolutely, we need people who understand IT security. Absolutely. We need people as well to understand the safety aspect. When they put a control in place or look for a threat, it's not necessarily going to be malware in the environment. It's all about knowing the ICS environment, spotting what's different in the environment, and so on. So safety is critical. The good news, again, is that spotting malicious activity in the ICS is actually far easier than in IT because of the static nature in control systems, which leads us into system design, which are also different in ICS as well. Supporting these engineering systems go well and beyond what we see in IT as well. And of course, the one I really want to focus on is the controls, but also incident response. How do we respond to an event? How do we recover from an event inside the control systems? A high impact, low frequency event, which are becoming more common. So why IT security technology can kill your ICS environment, and how to actually not make this happen. I've hired many teams, I've done assessments across many sectors in ICS. I never like the day when someone in IT security is tasked with OT security as well as, and they have this passion and they go into the environment and they do the same thing they've done in IT. Unfortunately, if that approach is taken, there's consequences. And I've seen teams, unfortunately, be kicked out of the plant as a result of, let's encrypt the entire ICS. Great ideology, it makes sense. We've been doing it for years, but doing that can have consequences. So I don't want you to get kicked out of an OT environment. So let's take a walk through. Typically, we see someone entering the ICS security responsibility or realm from different environments. They can come from anywhere, which is awesome, but they can come from these common areas. So for example, they step over a practitioner coming up to a manager. So folks that maybe have ICS or IT and engineering background responsible for critical infrastructure. Awesome, great, welcome aboard. Let's rock this to protect our critical infrastructure and our daily way of life. In place as well, an existing manager that has ICS security practitioners reporting to them already. This environment, of course, as well is heavily going to be tailored to the ICS. And last but not least is step over. We're seeing more and more people being tasked with OT security responsibilities. Fantastic, love it. IT security managers now that must create an OT or ICS environment and security program. Love it. The thing is that when we apply technologies and tools and processes from IT into the ICS directly without nuanced approaches, we can see things like this. Direct quote from DHS, which says, incident response deployed in IT business systems may result in ineffective or even disastrous consequences or results when applied to the ICS. So the question is, where is the safety aspect? Don't worry, we do have that here as well. Inside control systems, the incident response typically does consider safety at every step of the way. So things like the prioritization on safety, understanding that there's more engineering systems than IT, traditional systems as well, understanding the protocols that are maybe proprietary in the environment to see what is changed or what's malicious, and of course, legacy systems which we may not be able to patch. How do we deal with that? So when we look at the controls, IT versus OT, of course, antivirus we've been using for years in IT, again, works very well. Traditional signature-based, heuristics-based, you see something malicious, quarantine it, let's move on. We take it off the network, for example, we wipe the system, possibly do forensics analysis, put it back on the environment in IT to make sure productivity continues, and that is also awesome as well. In the ICS, the approach is slightly different because we prioritize safety. So as an example, antivirus is more so whitelisting, which is a lot easier to manage in the ICS than in IT. And of course, things like the patching we talked about, monthly like clockwork, IT's got this stuff nailed down. In ICS, it's much less frequent. It could be quarterly, it could be every twice a year, and so on and so forth, based on the prioritization of safety. So if there is an issue and it's contained, then maybe eradicating that issue or eradicating that threat fully, if it's contained, can be done in a next maintenance cycle for the engineering perspective. Now, the one I want to really look at is the last one here, which is network intrusion detection versus network intrusion prevention. In ICS, we prioritize detection rather than prevention as a result of not wanting to try to drop legitimate traffic in the control system to create a false positive. Creating false positives can cause things like a safety concern, and this is what we do not want in the ICS. So, what about our managers? What do they need to know? What are the top few things that we can take away from this discussion to action things for control system environments for our critical infrastructure protection? Let's jump into those. First thing I want to start off with is there's many things we can throw money at. There's many things that we can throw resources at. We suggest following something like the sliding scale of cybersecurity, where starting at the base, very, very cost-effective architecture. Architecting out the control system environment, cost-effective and very effective. Moving past that, passive defense, typical passive control specifically for the ICS, critical as well. But what I want to focus on today for where organizations should be in critical infrastructure is here, in the active defense area. You can see the sweet spot there of value and return on security, but also the cost. Yes, it's going to cost something, and it's going to cost resources, and somebody with the recipe we'll talk about to look for evil in a control system. This is where we should be today for at least our critical infrastructure environments. Now, if you take a look at the sliding scale of cybersecurity, active defense is right in the middle, where you can actually build this out. But what distinguishes active defense between that and architecture and passive defense is this is where we have to have humans understanding the control system that can look for evil in the environment. That means using this model here, which is practically in use today, and exercising this on a regular basis can absolutely find evil in your networks. The caveat is we're now talking about analysts, people monitoring. So going beyond technology, using technology, yes, to streamline, but analysts who monitor and respond to threats internal to the control system. Good news is most threats we have seen with impact to control systems are not overnight, which means using this cycle, we can get ahead of the adversary. We do not normally say that in a conversation in security, but we can get ahead of the adversary proactively by using this, which is consuming threat intelligence today, specific to your sector in the ICS. Notice there's a lot of folks here from the ISACs, which is super awesome to see them here this week. So ingesting the threat intelligence, looking at your network, which means you have to have visibility in your control system. I'm talking about passive visibility, looking at the control system, how it functions, and so on. Beyond that, you're going to detect threats. You're going to find something that's evil. It may not be Trisis, it may not be crash override, it may not be Stuxnet, for example. However, it will be a threat. And then you're going to respond to that using people again with this model. And the last part is threat and environment manipulation. How do then you change your environment or change the threat to reduce the impact to safety, reduce the impact to critical infrastructure damage? Good news is as well, this is applicable to any industrial control system, ICS or OT environment. So the recipe for folks we're looking for in the workforce is as follows. Yes, we definitely need folks who understand cybersecurity in general. From the IT background, yes, we need that. We also need, I would wager, ICS engineering knowledge, not specifically engineering degrees and so on and so forth, but knowing how the operations of a plant works, knowing what a PLC is, knowing what an RTU is, how the communication between those function, knowing when an operator pushes on a button on the HMI, whether it's Windows or not, or an embedded HMI, understanding on the network what happens is critical. Beyond that, the best, I would say, ICS cybersecurity workforce folks would have also an understanding of physical security, understanding of the environment, and of course, safety, which goes without saying. So top actions for facility stakeholders or managers who manage teams, technical teams for ICS and OT today are going to be summarized by these 6 things that we see. The 6th one is hidden for now. Let's run down through this. Obviously, having somebody trained on the engineering side of the house, right? Getting additional security information on the engineering side. It can come from threat intelligence, come from job shadowing, formal training, and so on and so forth. But using that traditional information technology security and the engineering while using the ACDC, active cyber defense cycle we've seen a moment ago, is going to be critical. Number 2 is embracing and knowing the fact that IT and OT are very different. Embrace that. Let's move on. Let's use what we've been doing for years where we can, where it's safe to do so in the ICS. Okay. Move on past that. We're then going to get visibility in the network. This is called passive monitoring, where we can now detect anything in the control system on the network, all the commands, operators push as an example, and then we can determine, once we have that passive visibility, right, that we can determine if there's malicious activity in there, monitoring that with people using the technology. Beyond that, of course, is leveraging ICS specific threat intelligence, which drives the entire active cyber defense cycle. And last but not least, to put this into practice, even as a manager or a practitioner in this area, highly recommend you focus on actually running an ICS threat-driven security tabletop exercise with management, VP of engineering, and so forth at the table as well as we pivot through. So that's all I wanted to chat with you about today. Defense is doable in control systems, and I do want to thank you for your time. And if there are any questions, then I can address that in a few moments. Or I can address them now. Yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to ask, what are your thoughts on the various frameworks that exist, 882, 62443, C2M2, NERC, SIP, all of this? If somebody's looking to step up their ICS security game, is there one over the other you would recommend they start with?
Yeah, I love that. So what frameworks would I utilize? NIST cybersecurity framework is a go-to. The other ones you mentioned as well, obviously seen in many sectors, NERC and NERC SIP, specifically for the energy sector. We've actually seen wastewater management environments use NERC SIP as well. I would say if you start with any of those, you're in the right place. C2M2, the EC2M2 is specifically designed as well for the electric sector. So I'm not partial to either of them. My approach is I run in and I put in technology and people in the seats first, and then I worry about frameworks afterwards because I want to focus on the technical aspect first. But any one of those you mentioned would absolutely be effective in furthering the maturity of an ICS specific security program. Yeah, great question. Excellent question. Any other thoughts, comments? Yes, sir.
So there's a lot of conversation right now around DHS and critical infrastructure. And one of the approaches DHS is looking at is penetration testing of these systems. Obviously, there's significant risk involved with that. So what's your take on where does that fit? Does that fit within ACDC, within your scale, as long as it's properly managed? Or
yeah, it's a great question. So just to reiterate for folks online, the question really is around, correct me if I'm wrong, how do I feel about penetration testing in ICS? I think it's a great opportunity to understand how penetration testing can help mature your program. Invariably, any penetration test will change the system. So just with IDS as an example, we don't typically want to change or block things. So there's high risk when you're doing penetration testing in ICS or OT, period, full stop. We do see value, though, in the higher level of Purdue. So coming from the IT environment, pretending to be an attacker to penetrate through IT, through a trusted zone like a data historian, into the upper levels of like 3.5 or level 3 in the Purdue model. And I see most of those penetration tests stop there. They can go further, but the more you go down, the more risk. You can do those things. Highly recommend you do those in a controlled environment, test environment before production, because you can cause failures. And if you're an awesome IT folk and you want to get into ICS, I would not recommend the first thing you do is a penetration test. But it has its place. Absolutely. Great question.